All right, we are almost done with Algebra 1 for the year. This section we're going to talk about completing the square. Completing the square is a special way of factoring and solving. So to complete the square, the first thing we want to do is make sure that our term without any x's is by itself on one side of the equation. So if I look at my example, I want 5 on the other side, so I'm going to add 5 to both sides. Next, we're going to divide everything by a. Now, a is the number in front of x squared. And sometimes there might not be a number there and we can skip step number 2. But we're going to divide everything by a. So I have 4 divided by 4 is going to cancel, not be 4. And I have x squared plus 2x is equal to 5 over 4. Next, I'm going to take half of b is the number in front of x, square it, and then add to both sides. So I need 2 divided by 2, which is 1, and then square it, which is still actually 1. So I'm going to add 1 to both sides. So I have x squared plus 2x plus 1 is equal to 5/4 plus 1. Well, 1 is 4/4, so 5 plus 4 is 9/4. Okay. On the left-hand side, I now have a perfect square trinomial. And I know that because I made it. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to factor. And as long as I do it correctly, I should be able to factor it like this. So this should really be x plus 1 times x plus 1, which is really annoying when my settings try to pop up on me. X plus 1 times x plus 1, which is really x plus 1 squared. Now the last part says to solve. And we didn't do a lot of solving with squares this year. But the opposite of a square is a square root. So I'm going to square root everything I see. The square root will cancel out with the square, leaving me x plus 1. And then I'm going to square root both the 9 and the 4. So the square root of 9 is 3. And the square root of 4 is 2. And I'm going to say plus or minus, because it doesn't really matter when I square root whether my answer is positive or negative. Both could be true, because positive 3 times positive 3 is 9, and negative 3 times negative 3 is 9. Or if it makes you happier, you could split it into 2 separate equations once you square root. You could say one was positive. Stop that. And you could say one was negative. And finish solving for x. So minus 1 from both of them. X ends up being equal to 1/2 and negative 5/2. So that was a lot of mess because it was the example and it was a harder one. Let's look at something maybe a little bit easier. Let's look at example number 1. Start off. Get the number without a variable by itself. So subtract 6 from both sides. 2x squared minus 8x equals negative 6. Step 2. Divide everything by the number in front of the x squared. Divide everything by a. So this cancels, and I have x squared minus 4x is equal to negative 3. All right, this is the part that we have to remember. I want to take b, which is negative 4, cut it in half, so divide by 2, which is negative 2, and then square. So negative 2 times negative 2 is 4. I'm going to add 4 to both sides. So x squared minus 4x plus 4 is equal to 1. Now I can factor. And remember my little shortcut, my factor is always going to be parenthesis x, and then I'm going to take the sign of b, so my b was negative, so I'm going to say minus, and then half of b, so minus 2 squared is equal to 1. Now I finish solving. The opposite of a square is a square root, so I'm going to square root both sides. That cancels and leaves me x minus 2 is equal to 1, and x minus 2 is equal to a negative 1. So I add 2 to both sides. X equals 3 or 1. All right. So starting again from the top. Get the number without a variable by itself. Divide everything by the number out front. And this is the tricky part. Take your b, so in this case my negative 6, divide by 2, and square. Negative 3 squared is 9, so I'm going to add 9 to both sides. I can factor, and I know my factor is always going to be parenthesis x. Take my sign from b, so negative. Half of b is negative 3 squared. Square root both sides to get rid of the square. And remember that makes a positive and a negative. So negative 3x equals 5, and x minus 3 equals negative 5. And then solve both equations. X can be equal to 8 or negative 2. Let's do another example, just for funsies. Let's do number 3. Now remember, I want the numbers without the variables all on one side by themselves. So I'm going to start by adding 34 to both sides. I have 5x squared plus 10x equals 40. Divide everything by the number out front. If there is a number out front. There might not be a number out front, and that's fine. That just means you get to skip this step. So x squared plus 2x equals 8. Now take my b. So 2, cut it in half, which is 1, and then square it, which is still 1. That's what I need to add to both sides. Then I can factor, and I set it up to be able to use a shortcut. So x, half of b, which is 1, squared. Then I can solve. To get rid of the square, I square root. X plus 1 is equal to 3. And x plus 1 equals negative 3. Subtract 1 from both sides. I got answers 2 and negative 4. Let's do one more example just to really ingrain it into your head. Oops. Okay. Move it to the other side if it doesn't have a variable. 4x squared plus 8x equals negative 3. Get rid of the number out front by dividing. Divide everything in this case by 4. Take my b, cut it in half, square that answer. That's what needs to get added to both sides. So x squared plus 2x plus 1 is equal to 1/4. Shortcut to factor. Parenthesis x, half of b is a positive 1 squared. It's equal to my 1/4. Get rid of the square by square rooting. Remember, if it's a fraction, I square root both the top and bottom. Square root of 1 is 1, square root of 4 is 2. And then I still need the negative. So negative 1 over 2. And solve. Subtract 1 from everything. X would be equal to negative 1/2 and negative 2. 3/2. All right. I will do examples 5 and 6 and post them in the classroom for you to look at. I recommend you give them a try before I post them. And you can go ahead and forget about 7, 8, 9, and 10. Those ones are a little bit different. We're not going to talk about those this year. But that is your steps for solving by completing the square.